The sun was a hammer in a white-hot sky, and the land beneath it was an anvil. For as far as the eye could see, which was a very long way, there was nothing but the pale, cracked earth gasping for a breath of rain it had not known in months. Heat shimmered up from the ground in glassy waves, distorting the horizon until the distant, tooth-like mountains seemed to melt and tremble. Dust, finer than milled flour, was the world's only seasoning. It coated the stiff blades of buffalo grass, settled in a gritty film on the water in a man's canteen, and worked its way into the folds of his clothes and the lines around his eyes. Silence was the other constant. It was not a peaceful silence, not the quiet of a country morning. This was a profound and intimidating stillness, a presence so vast and complete that it pressed in on the ears. It swallowed the plodding hoofbeats of a lone horse, the creak of worn saddle leather, the soft jingle of a bit. The land did not care for sound. It did not care for the man who made it. It had been here long before him and would remain long after his bones were scoured clean and scattered by the wind. Silas understood this. He moved through the endless space as if he were a part of it, his motions measured and spare. At 28, his face was already a map of the country he traveled, tanned to the color of old leather and etched with lines from squinting into the relentless sun. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, held a watchfulness that never fully rested. He rode with a slight slump in his shoulders, not of laziness, but of a deep and settled weariness. He and his dun horse, Abel, were two solitary figures adrift in an ocean of grass and sky. He had been on this drift for the better part of a year, though he had stopped marking the time. Time was measured in sunrises and sunsets, in the clench of a hungry belly and the blessed relief of a full canteen. He was not heading toward any particular destination. He was simply moving away. Away from a place where the silence had once been filled with a voice he could no longer recall without a sharp, surprising ache in his chest. Away from the memory of a small hand tucked in his, and the heavy guilt of a promise he had failed to keep. He preferred the company of his horse now. Abel's needs were simple and honest. Water, feed, a firm but gentle hand on the reins. People were more complicated. Their sorrows could latch onto a man, become a weight he was not strong enough to carry. Silas was already carrying all the weight he could bear. He let his gaze sweep the horizon, a habit as ingrained as breathing. Sky, grass, rock, sky, grass, rock. Then something else, a smudge of darkness near the sluggish, brown ribbon of a river that snaked through the plain. It was too small for a buffalo, too still for a coyote. He reined Abel to a slow walk, his hand resting lightly on his thigh. Inches from the worn wooden grip of his colt, the land taught caution above all else. A man alone was either careful or he was dead. As he drew closer, the smudge took on a human shape, a person, sitting by the water's edge, so motionless they might have been carved from the dried mud of the riverbank. He dismounted 100 yards out, the soft thud of his boots absorbed by the thirsty earth. He ground-tethered Abel, giving the horse a quiet pat on the neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He approached on foot, his steps slow and deliberate, making no effort to hide his presence. Surprising anything out here was a fool's game. The figure did not move. It was a woman. He saw now. Or a girl. It was hard to tell. She was a picture of utter desolation, a study in ruin. Her dress was little more than a collection of faded, grimy rags hanging from a thin frame. Her hair, a tangled and matted mess, fell forward, hiding her face completely. She sat with her head down, her arms wrapped around her knees, as if trying to hold herself together. She was so still, so utterly defeated, that for a moment Silas wondered if she was breathing at all. He stopped about 15 feet away, a distance that felt both safe and respectful. He could smell the stagnant water of the river, the sun-baked mud, and a faint, sour scent of despair that seemed to cling to her. He stood there for a long minute, the silence stretching between them, pulled taut as a wire. He considered turning around, mounting his horse, and riding away. This was not his business. This was a sorrow deeper than any he wanted to touch. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for another's. But he thought of his sister, Sarah, in her last days, the way she had grown so quiet, her eyes too big for her face, her spirit shrinking until it was just a tiny, flickering ember. He had been helpless then, and the memory was a burr under his saddle blanket, a constant, dull irritation. He could not ride away. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and unnatural in the immense quiet. "Ma'am?" No response. She remained as still as stone. He tried again, his voice rough from disuse. He could not remember the last time he had spoken to another person. A week, 2? "You want some food?" The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Her entire body flinched, a sharp, convulsive jerk, as if he had struck her with a whip. It was not the simple startle of someone lost in thought. It was the absolute, visceral terror of a rabbit that feels the shadow of a hawk pass over it. Her arms tightened around her legs, her knuckles white. She curled in on herself, making herself smaller, a knot of pure fear. But she did not look up. She did not make a sound. Silas held up his hands, though she could not see the gesture. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I mean you no harm." He saw the tremor that ran through her slight frame. He recognized it. It was the deep, shuddering terror of an animal caught in a trap, a creature that had been hurt so badly it expected nothing but more pain from the world. Her mind was a fortress, and she had pulled up the drawbridge, barred the gates, and refused to look out the windows. To press her would be a cruelty. It would be like yelling at a bird with a broken wing, trying to force it to fly. He took a slow step back, then another. He backed away until he was near Abel again, never taking his eyes off her. He unstrapped his saddlebags and pulled out his meager supplies. There was not much. A strip of dried beef, hard as wood. A few pieces of hardtack, dry enough to suck every drop of moisture from a man's mouth. A small pouch of coffee and a tin of beans he had been saving. It was not a feast, but it was life. He walked not toward her, but to a large, flat rock that sat in the sun about 30 feet from where she sat. He placed a piece of the jerky and 2 squares of hardtack on the stone. He hesitated for a moment, then untied his own canteen from his saddle horn and set it beside the food. Water was more precious than gold out here, but the sight of the river, slow and brown and thick with alkali, made the choice for him. A person could die of thirst drinking that water. He retreated to his own small camp, a respectable distance away, behind a scraggly patch of sagebrush that offered the barest illusion of privacy. He unsaddled Abel, curried him down, and let him graze on the sparse grass. He moved with purpose, performing the familiar chores of his solitary life. He did not build a fire. Smoke could be seen for miles. He sat with his back against his saddle, chewing on his own small ration of jerky, and watched her. The sun bled across the sky, a spectacular and brutal display of color. The horizon burned crimson and orange, and long, purple shadows stretched out from every rock and clump of grass. The heat of the day began to recede, replaced by the first hints of the night's chill. The woman by the river had not moved. She was a silhouette now, a dark shape huddled against the fading light. Silas began to wonder if she would ever move again, if she would simply let herself waste away on that muddy bank. He felt a familiar sense of helplessness creep into his gut. There was nothing he could do. He had made the offer. The rest was up to her. Just as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the mountains, leaving the plains in a deep, gray twilight. She moved. It was a quick, furtive motion. She scrambled to her feet, her movements clumsy but fast. She scurried to the flat rock, her head still bowed, snatched the food in the canteen, and then retreated back to her spot by the river. She fell back into her huddle, and Silas could just make out the frantic motion of her arm as she ate, tearing at the jerky with a desperate, animal hunger. She ate like a person who was not sure where her next meal would come from, or if it would come at all. She drank from the canteen in long, ragged gulps. When she was finished, she set the empty canteen back on the rock. It was not a thank you. Silas knew. It was simply the end of a transaction. He had left something. She had taken it. There was no debt, no connection. He lay back in his bedroll, pulling his blanket up to his chin. The stars began to appear, cold and distant in the black ink of the sky. He listened to the vast silence, now punctuated by the soft cropping sound of Abel grazing nearby. He did not know if the woman slept. He lay awake for a long time, thinking that loneliness was a strange and terrible country, and that he had just met one of its lost citizens. The morning arrived pale and cold. A thin layer of frost covered his blanket. Silas rose before the sun, his movements quiet and efficient in the pre-dawn gloom. He made a small, smokeless fire of dried buffalo chips, just enough to boil water for coffee. The bitter, scalding liquid was a welcome shock to his system. He broke his camp, rolling his bedroll and strapping it behind his saddle. His routine so practiced it required no thought. When his work was done, he stood and looked toward the river. She was still there, in the exact same spot, but she was not huddled now. She was watching him. He could not see her face, still hidden by the curtain of her hair, but he could feel the weight of her gaze across the distance. She was a ghost in the gray morning light, a specter haunting the riverbank. He swung himself up onto Abel's back. The leather creaked a familiar complaint. This was the moment of decision. He had done what his conscience demanded. He had offered food and water to a fellow creature in need. He had a right now to ride on. He had his own path to follow, his own path to outrun. He nudged Abel with his heels, turning the horse west, away from her. He did not look back. He rode at a slow, steady walk, the sun climbing at his back, casting his long shadow out before him. The plains rolled on, unchanging. An hour passed. The sun grew warmer, burning the frost off the grass. The silence and the solitude settled back around him. A familiar cloak, but something felt different, a prickle of awareness on the back of his neck. He finally gave in to the urge. He slowed Abel and, as if simply surveying the land, he casually glanced over his shoulder. She was there, a tiny figure, a quarter-mile behind him. Maybe more. She was on foot, a small dot moving steadily through the immense landscape. She was keeping a significant distance, a gulf of dry land and wary mistrust between them. But she was following him, a shadow, tracking his progress across the plains. Silas faced forward again, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. He had not invited her. He had not spoken another word to her. He had, in fact, ridden away from her, and yet, here they were. He was leading, and she was following. A silent, unspoken agreement had been formed in the vast, empty heart of the West. He did not know her name, her story, or the nature of the horror that had hollowed her out. He only knew that he was no longer completely alone. The days bled one into the next, each a copy of the one before, written on a fresh page of unforgiving landscape. Their silent procession became a rhythm, a strange and lonely dance across the vastness. Silas rode ahead, a solitary figure guiding them west, while she followed on foot, a persistent shadow he could never quite shake. The distance between them remained a constant, 100 yards of sun-scorched earth and unspoken agreement. It was a space charged with caution and a fragile, unacknowledged dependence. He never tried to close it, never turned in the saddle to beckon her closer, and she never ventured to shorten the gap. Her world contained within the small bubble of her own cautious footsteps. They moved from the flat, endless plains into a country of low, rolling hills dotted with stunted cedar and gnarled juniper. The landscape was a third character in their silent play, its moods dictating their lives. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a placid, cloudless blue, turned the color of a deep bruise. The air grew heavy and still, thick with a coppery smell. Silas felt the change in his bones. He scanned the horizon, his gaze settling on a dark line of bluffs a few miles ahead. "Come on, Abel," he urged, his voice a low rumble. He picked up the pace, not quite a trot, but a walk with urgent purpose. He did not look back to see if she understood, but he knew she would. Survival was a language they both spoke fluently. The storm broke with the sudden violence of an ambush. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a physical force, whipping dust and grass into the air. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that stung the skin and turned the world into a gray blur. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, followed instantly by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Silas reached the bluffs just as the deluge began in earnest, finding a shallow overhang, more a scoop in the rock than a proper cave, but it offered shelter. He led Abel into the driest part of the space and turned to look out at the storm. For a moment, he thought she had been lost to the maelstrom, swallowed by the fury of the sky. Then he saw her, a small, drenched figure struggling against the wind, her tattered dress plastered to her thin frame. She staggered into the shelter and collapsed into a heap in the farthest, darkest corner, pulling her knees to her chest. The space was no more than 20 feet across. For the first time in over a week, they were close enough to hear each other breathe. The proximity was a palpable thing, a tension that filled the small shelter. Rain cascaded down in front of the opening, a roaring curtain that sealed them inside together. Silas took off his hat and beat the water from it, then unstrapped his slicker and sat on his heels near the entrance, his back to her. He became a silent guardian, a barrier between her and the storm. He could feel her presence behind him, could sense her fear. It was a cold, sharp thing, different from her usual terror. This was a fear of the storm's raw power, a force of nature that dwarfed human concerns. He stared out into the gray chaos, listening to the thunder and the sound of her quiet, ragged breaths, and said nothing. His small acts of care continued, becoming as much a part of his daily routine as checking Abel's hooves. Each morning, before he set out, he would fill her canteen from his own water bags, leaving it on the now designated flat rock between their sleeping places. He never expected thanks, and received none. It was simply part of their rhythm. One evening, his patience with jerky and hardtack wore thin. He took his rifle and slipped into the twilight, returning an hour later with a plump jackrabbit. He skinned and cleaned it with practiced efficiency, his knife moving with a surgeon's precision. He built a small fire, the flames licking at the sticks of rabbit meat he roasted over them. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, a savory and comforting aroma in the vast emptiness. When it was done, he ate his portion, and then, as was his custom, he placed a generous piece on a clean stone for her. He knew she watched him from the darkness, a hungry ghost drawn to the small circle of firelight. He knew she would not approach until he had retreated into his bedroll and the illusion of sleep. From inside her fortress of silence, Alara watched the world through a haze of fear. Her mind was a storm-tossed sea, and memories were jagged pieces of wreckage that surfaced without warning. The scent of wood smoke could send her spiraling back into a world of fire and screams. A splintering sound, like Silas chopping firewood, could bring back the terrifying crash of a door kicked from its hinges. Red, the color of the setting sun on the horizon, was the color of her father's shirt, the color of the ground a moment later. These fragments were all she had left of her family, terrifying shards of a life that had been violently shattered. Silence was her only shield. Words were dangerous. Words could be twisted, used as weapons. Words had failed her when she had stumbled into town, soot-stained and babbling, trying to explain the impossible. They had called her a liar, crazy, their faces hard with suspicion and disgust. So she had abandoned words, wrapped herself in a cloak of muteness, and found that the world mostly left a silent, crazy girl alone. She followed the man, Silas, for a simple reason. He was less terrifying than the alternative. The wilderness was a vast, unpredictable predator. It offered thirst, starvation, and 1,000 ways to die alone. The man, by contrast, was a model of quiet predictability. He rose with the sun. He rode west. He found water. He shared his food. He asked for nothing. He did not try to speak to her, did not try to close the distance she so desperately needed to maintain. He was a steady, silent presence, a rock in the churning chaos of her existence. She did not trust him. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed, but his patterns were a comfort. He was the lesser of two dangers, and in her world, that was the closest thing to safety she could find. They had made camp in a shallow, rocky coulee that offered some protection from the relentless wind. The day had been long and hot, and Alara sought a patch of shade near a jumble of sun-bleached boulders. She was tired, her feet sore, her mind a dull hum of exhaustion. She moved without her usual hypervigilance, her focus blurred. She reached down to pick up a piece of dried mesquite for their separate, tiny fires, her hand moving toward the dark space beneath a large, flat rock. A sound, dry and sharp as shaking seeds in a dead gourd, cut through the afternoon stillness. Alara froze, her head snapped up. Not 3 feet from her hand, coiled in the shade, was a rattlesnake, its spade-shaped head raised, its black tongue tasting the air. Its tail was a blur of angry vibration. As her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she saw another, and then a third. She had stumbled into a nest. Every muscle in her body locked. A scream lodged in her throat. A choked, silent thing. She could not run. She could not breathe. Her mind, already so fragile, simply broke. The world dissolved into a meaningless buzz, her vision tunneling until all she could see was the serpent's unblinking, obsidian eyes. She was no longer a girl on a prairie. She was pure, paralyzed fear, an animal mesmerized by its own death. Silas was mending a strap on his bridle when the sound reached him. He knew that sound. It was one of the plane's deadliest warnings. He was on his feet in an instant, his pistol in his hand before he had consciously decided to draw it. He saw her, saw the snakes, and his mind went cold and clear. There was no time for shouting, no time for anything but action. He moved in a low crouch, his steps swift and silent, closing the distance. He raised the Colt, his arm steady, his eyes sighting down the barrel. The first shot was a deafening crack that sent birds scattering from a nearby bush. The head of the nearest snake vanished in a spray of dust and blood. The other two struck at the air, their bodies coiling and uncoiling in confusion. The second shot and the third followed in quick succession, each one a precise and final punctuation mark. The echoes of the gunshots faded, leaving a ringing silence. The danger was over. The snakes lay twitching in the dust. Silas slowly lowered his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the girl. He expected her to have run, to have screamed, to have done something, but she remained where she was, frozen in the same position, her eyes wide and blank, staring at the dead creatures. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle. "They're gone." She did not respond. She did not even seem to hear him. He holstered his pistol and approached her slowly, cautiously, as if she were a wild horse that might bolt. "Ma'am," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Are you hurt?" Still nothing. She was trapped somewhere deep inside herself, locked in the prison of her terror. He knew he had to break the spell. He had to touch her. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt in front of her, forcing himself into her line of sight. "I'm just going to check for bites," he said, keeping his voice a low, steady murmur. "Don't you move." He reached out and gently took hold of her ankle. Her skin was cold. A violent tremor ran through her entire body at his touch, a massive shudder that seemed to shake her from head to toe. But she did not pull away. His touch was clinical, respectful. His fingers moved up her leg, checking for any sign of a puncture. His examination quick and impersonal. He checked her other leg, then her arms and hands. He saw no marks. "Oh, you're all right," he said, relief in his voice. "You're not bit. You're safe." It was the first human contact she had experienced since the night her world had ended. That contact had been brutal, violent, and full of hate. This touch was different. It was not gentle in a sentimental way. It was the practical, firm touch of a caretaker. It was a touch that said, "I am checking for injury." A touch that offered help, not harm. She remained frozen, but the uncontrollable trembling continued. A long, slow earthquake of shock and fear finally being released. That night, something changed. When Alara made her small camp, the distance between her bedroll and Silas's was smaller. Not by much, perhaps only 10 or 15 feet. But it was a deliberate, measurable shift. A concession, an acknowledgement. From the corner of her eye, she watched him. Before, she had only tracked his position, marking him as a potential threat. Now, for the first time, she truly saw him. She watched the deliberate, patient way he brushed down his horse, his hands moving with a firm gentleness over the animal's flanks, his voice a low, soothing murmur that she could not quite hear but could feel. She watched him check the stitching on his gear, his calloused fingers working a needle and thread with a surprising dexterity. He was a man who took care of things, a man who mended what was broken, a man who endured. He was not a monster. He was just quiet. The night grew cold, a deep, bone-aching chill that crept in from the plains. Alara huddled in her tattered dress, shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself for a warmth that was not there. Silas saw it. He had been lying in his bedroll, watching the stars, but his attention was on the small, trembling shape in the darkness. He had one spare blanket. It was old, woven from coarse wool, smelling faintly of horse and wood smoke, but it was warm. He thought for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he pushed himself up. He picked up the blanket and walked into the space between them. He did not go all the way to her camp. He stopped in the middle, shook the blanket out, and laid it on the ground. Then he turned and walked back to his own spot, settling into his bedroll and turning his back to her, feigning sleep. He heard the rustle of movement. He heard her hesitant footsteps on the dry ground. A long pause. Then, the soft sound of the blanket being picked up. Another pause, and the whisper of her retreating steps. He lay perfectly still, listening. He heard her settle down, the wool a shield against the cold. The silence returned, deeper than before. He closed his eyes, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. It was not pity. It was something quieter, warmer. He must have drifted off. What woke him was a sound so soft it was almost part of the wind. A word, whispered into the embers of his dying fire. "Thanks." The voice was a hoarse, scratchy thing, broken from disuse. It was barely audible, but in the vast silence of the plains, it was as loud as a gunshot. Silas's eyes snapped open in the darkness. He did not move a muscle, did not give any sign that he had heard, but the single word struck him with an unexpected and devastating force. It was a crack in the wall of her silence, a flicker of light from a soul he thought had gone completely dark. It was a seed of trust, planted in the most barren soil imaginable, and for the first time in a very long time, Silas felt the weight on his own soul lighten, just a little. That single whispered word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, a tiny seed of sound planted in an immense garden of silence. It did not bring a flood of conversation. The morning came, and with it, the familiar, quiet routine. Silas broke camp, saddled Abel and prepared to move on. But there was a difference. When he glanced toward her camp, she was already standing, the coarse wool blanket folded neatly on the ground where she had slept. And when he began to ride, the distance she kept behind him was smaller, the 100 yards of mistrust shrinking to perhaps 50. It was a small but significant closing of a great divide. They traveled for 2 days in this new, less strained silence. On the third afternoon, as Silas was cleaning his rifle, she spoke again. Her voice, still a rough whisper, was quiet but clear. "Ilara?" He stopped his work, his hands still. He did not look at her, not wanting to spook her with a direct gaze. He just held the oiled rag and the steel of his rifle and let her name settle in the air between them. It was the first piece of herself she had offered. He understood it was a gift, a fragile thing. "Ilara," he repeated, his own voice low. It was a good name. It sounded strong. He said nothing more, simply went back to cleaning his weapon, the quiet rhythm of his work a sign of acceptance. The name was a key, turning a lock he had not known was there. Her story began to emerge, not in a rush, but in drips and drops, like water seeping through stone. It came in broken sentences, offered up at unexpected moments. One evening, staring into the flames of the small fire, she said, "My brother, Emile, he liked rabbits." Another time, seeing a hawk circle high overhead, she whispered, "Papa said they could see the whole world." Silas became a vessel for these fragments. He never pressed for more, never asked the questions that burned in his mind. He simply listened, his quiet stillness an invitation for her to continue when she was ready. He learned of their small, isolated homestead, carved out of the wilderness by the unceasing labor of her parents. They had come from the old country, she explained, with strange words on their tongues and customs that were not the customs of the nearby town. They were good people, she insisted, her voice gaining a flicker of strength. Her father, a man with hands as broad and steady as oaken planks. Her mother, who could make a garden bloom in the hard, unforgiving soil and whose lullabies smelled of rosemary and thyme. Her brother, Emile, a boy of 10 with a wild laugh and a gift for finding birds' nests. She painted a picture of a small, self-contained world, a world of hard work and simple joys, a world that had been whole, but there was a shadow at the edge of her memories. She spoke of the town, a place called Jasper Creek, and her voice would grow thin, her words faltering. She spoke of the looks they received, the way the women would whisper behind their hands when her mother went to the mercantile. They were outsiders, foreigners, squatters in the eyes of the men who had been there longer. The full story, the terrible heart of it, came one night when a pack of coyotes began to yip and howl in the distance. The sound, a chorus of wild, manic laughter, seemed to trigger something deep within her. She sat bolt upright from her bedroll, her body rigid, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for the animals in the dark, but for a memory they had awakened. Silas, who had been watching the stars, sat up slowly. "Just coyotes," he said softly. But she was already gone, lost in the past. Her narrative, when it came, was no longer a collection of broken sentences. It was a torrent, a flood of horror unleashed. The words poured from her, disjointed and raw, interspersed with vivid, painful flashes of memory that played out behind her eyes. "The land," she began, her voice a strained rasp. "It was the water, our creek. It ran all summer. Thorn's land went dry by August." She spoke the name, Thorn, and it was like a curse on her lips. Elias Thorn, a powerful man, with a ranch that spread over half the county. A man who smiled in church on Sunday and hired men who did his dirty work. He wanted our land, told my father to sell. My father said no. He said this land was ours. We had the papers. The harassment had started small, a fence cut, letting their few cattle wander, their well fouled with a dead animal, forcing them to haul water from the creek. Then came the visits. Thorne's men, led by a foreman named Fletcher with a cruel twist to his mouth, would ride up to their homestead. They would not dismount. They would just sit on their horses, their presence a silent, looming threat, their eyes lingering on her mother in a way that made Ilara's skin crawl. The threats became bolder, muttered words about what happened to stubborn folk who did not know their place. The night it happened, the air had been still and warm. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Emil was asleep, and Ilara was helping her mother mend a shirt by the light of a kerosene lamp. The memory came upon her then, a vivid, waking nightmare. The splintering crash of the front door being kicked in. The sound was an explosion in their quiet home. Her father's surprised shout, a mix of anger and fear. Her mother's scream, a thin, sharp sound that was cut off abruptly. Ilara had been frozen for a heartbeat, and then her father's training, his constant, worried warnings, took over. "The cellar! Ilara! Now!" She had scrambled across the wooden floor and slipped through the small trap door, pulling it shut just as heavy boots stomped into the room. She huddled in the small, dark space below, the earthy smell of potatoes and preserved beets filling her nostrils. She pressed her eye to a crack between the floorboards. What she saw was a scene from hell, illuminated by the unsteady glow of a lantern. Fletcher and two other men. They were large, brutal shapes. She saw her father fighting back, a desperate, valiant struggle. But he was 1 against 3. She saw him go down. She saw her mother's terrified face, her hands held up as if to ward off the inevitable. She heard Emil cry out from his room, a sleepy, frightened sound. The men's voices were low and guttural, their laughter a horrifying counterpoint to the sounds of violence. Through the crack, she saw flashes of movement, of struggle, of a terrible, final stillness. The lantern was kicked over, and the room was plunged into darkness. But the sounds continued for a few moments more. Then, an awful quiet. She heard them talking, their voices clear now in the silence. "That's all of them," Fletcher said. "The boy, too." "What about the girl?" another voice asked. "Probably ran off into the dark. Won't last a night. Even if she does, who's gonna believe a crazy immigrant girl?" Fletcher's laugh was a cold, empty sound. Thorne was right. The old man went crazy, killed his family, set the place on fire. Tragic. Then, a new smell. Kerosene. It sloshed onto the floorboards just above her head, the fumes sharp and sickening. Ilara pressed herself against the cool dirt wall of the cellar, stuffing a fist in her mouth to keep from screaming. She heard the scrape of a match, and then a whoosh as the world above her erupted in flame. Firelight flickered through the cracks, casting dancing, demonic shadows in her small hiding place. The heat grew intense. Smoke began to snake through the floorboards, thick and choking. She could hear the roar of the fire, the crackle and pop of the old, dry wood of her home being consumed. It was the sound of her world ending. She did not know how long she stayed there, huddled in the dark, listening to her home burn to the ground. She must have passed out from the smoke. When she woke, it was to a sliver of gray morning light filtering through a section where the floor had burned completely away. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and something else, a sweet, greasy odor that made her stomach heave. She crawled out of the cellar into the smoking ruins. Everything was gone. Blackened timbers, piles of ash, the twisted metal of the wood stove. The rising sun cast a pale, sickly light on the devastation. Her story faltered then, her voice breaking. She stumbled through the rest of it. How she had walked the miles to Jasper Creek, a ghost girl coated in soot, her mind a complete blank. She had gone for help, believing, with the last shred of a child's faith, that someone would help her, that justice would be done. But when she staggered onto the town's dusty main street, her clothes in tatters, her face blackened, her words a garbled mess of terror and grief, she was met not with sympathy, but with horror and revulsion. People backed away from her. The sheriff, a man with a tin star and empty eyes, listened to her frantic, incoherent story for a minute before waving her away dismissively. Elias Thorne had already been there. He had ridden into town at dawn with a somber face, telling everyone the tragic news. That poor homesteader, Muller, had finally snapped. A terrible, shocking thing. The town, which had always viewed her family with suspicion, readily accepted the lie. It was easier. It fit with what they already believed about strange people with strange accents. They saw her, the lone survivor, not as a victim, but as the crazed remnant of a tragedy they did not want to understand. She was an inconvenience, a dirty, wild thing that had crawled out of the ashes. When she finished her story, she was trembling, her face buried in her hands. A terrible, racking silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the coyotes. Silas did not move. He sat across the small fire from her, his face illuminated by the flickering light, his expression unreadable. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not tell her it would be all right. He did not say he was sorry for her loss. The platitudes of a safe and orderly world had no meaning out here, and they would have been an insult to the depth of her wound. Instead, he simply sat with her in her pain. He bore witness to her story, his unwavering, patient stillness a testament to its truth. His silence was not empty. It was full of a profound and solemn respect for the horror she had endured. They sat that way for a long time, the fire burning down to glowing embers. Finally, when her trembling had subsided into a weary quiet, he spoke. His voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it. "I had a sister," he said, his gaze fixed on the dying coals. "Her name was Sarah. She was younger than me by 5 years." Elara looked up, her tear-streaked face pale in the starlight. He continued, his words slow and deliberate, as if he were pulling them from a deep and painful well. "We came west with our folks, from Ohio, had a dream of a place in Oregon. Sarah, she was so excited. She talked the whole way about the ocean she'd never seen." He paused, the memory sharp. "The cholera took her on the Platte River. It was fast. One day she was chasing butterflies. The next she was gone." He picked up a small stick and poked at the embers, his movements heavy. "I was 14. I was supposed to be the man of the family. My father was weak with the fever himself. I was supposed to look after her, but I couldn't do anything. I just watched her get smaller and weaker. I held her hand, and it was hot as a stove lid. I fetched her water she couldn't keep down. I felt useless." He tossed the stick into the embers, where it glowed brightly for a moment before turning to ash. "I should have been able to save her. That's what an older brother is for. I've carried that with me ever since." He looked across the fire at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the weathered, stoic cowboy. She saw the 14-year-old boy, helpless by a riverbank, watching his sister die. His sorrow was not as violent or as brutal as hers, but it was just as deep, a quiet, persistent ache that had shaped the man he had become. In that moment, a powerful, unspoken bond was forged between them. It was a connection born not of flirtation or fancy, but of the shared, terrible knowledge of loss. They were two survivors, two wounded souls who had washed up on the shore of the same desolate country. They had seen the ugliest parts of life, and in each other's eyes, they found not pity, but a profound and solemn understanding. The romance that began to kindle between them that night was not a bright, easy flame. It was a small, stubborn glow in the heart of a great darkness, a love born from the ashes. The intimacy born of their shared grief was a fragile shelter, a small warmth against the vast, cold indifference of the wilderness. But the wilderness had a way of reminding them that survival was a matter of practicalities, not just of the soul. Their supply of flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack. The jerky was gone, and the last of the coffee had been boiled twice. The true crisis came with a discordant clink and a stumble. Silas dismounted immediately, running a hand down Abel's leg. He swore softly under his breath. The horse had thrown a shoe. The hoof was already beginning to show wear. To continue on would be to lame his only means of transport, their only hope of outrunning the distances that defined this land. "There's a town marked on my map," Silas said, his voice grim. "Redemption Gulch, about a day's ride, if we take it slow." Ilara looked at him, her eyes wide with an old, familiar fear. The town of Jasper Creek had been her second great trauma, a place of betrayal where her pain had been met with scorn. The thought of entering another town, of subjecting herself to the stares and judgments of strangers, was a terrifying prospect. But she saw the hard set of Silas's jaw and the worry in his eyes as he looked at Abel's hoof. They had no choice. A flicker of hope, stubborn and unwelcome, began to kindle within them as they traveled. A town meant a proper meal, something other than fire-roasted prairie hen. It meant a roof over their heads for a night, a bed that did not have rocks for a mattress. It meant supplies, a new shoe for Abel, a brief moment of rest from the constant, wearing vigilance of the trail. The name itself, Redemption Gulch, seemed to offer a promise, however unlikely, of a place where they could find some small measure of peace. The promise soured the moment they saw it. The town was a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings huddled in a sun-bleached valley, looking less like a settlement and more like a permanent state of desperation. A single, wide street, ankle-deep in dust, ran through its center. There was no joy in this place, no sign of life beyond the necessary movements of commerce and survival. The air was thick with the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer and another, more disquieting sound, the high, reedy voice of a preacher, his words spilling from the open doors of a stark white church. "And the serpent comes in many forms," the preacher cried, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "He comes as the vagrant, with sloth in his heart. He comes as the stranger, with wickedness in his eyes, and he sends his temptress, the fallen woman, a Jezebel in rags, to lead the righteous astray. Beware the outsider, for they are the devil's servants, sent to test our virtue and poison our well of faith." Silas felt Ilara tense behind him on the horse. He had insisted she ride to make their entrance less conspicuous, but it was a futile gesture. As they moved down the main street, it was as if a string had been pulled, turning every head in their direction. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Men in dusty hats stopped and stared, their eyes lingering on Ilara's ragged dress and the wild tangle of her hair. Curtains in the windows of the clapboard houses twitched. Worst of all were the women. They gathered in small, tight knots outside the mercantile, their faces pinched with a sour, righteous piety. They whispered behind their hands, their venomous speculations as audible as the preacher's sermon. "Look at the state of her. Ridden hard and put away wet. I'd say, some drifter's doxy. Ought to be ashamed, showing her face in a decent town." The words were like stones, and Ilara flinched with each one. The fragile confidence she had begun to build in the wilderness crumbled to dust. She shrank behind Silas's broad back, pulling her hair forward to hide her face, returning to the invisible, huddled girl he had found by the river. The open hostility was a suffocating force, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Silas felt a cold anger rise in him. He kept his face a stony mask, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but his hand rested on his thigh, a silent reassurance that his pistol was close. His plan was simple: get in, get out. He found the smithy and dismounted, helping Ilara down. The blacksmith, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, grunted when Silas explained what he needed. "Take an hour, maybe 2, he said, not bothering to look at Ilara. "We need supplies," Silas said to her, his voice low. "I'll get the horse seen to. You go to that mercantile across the street. Get flour, salt, coffee, whatever you can. Keep your head down and don't talk to anyone." He pressed a few worn coins into her hand. Her hand was ice cold. She looked terrified, but she nodded, clutching the coins as if they were a talisman. He had just begun to describe the specific type of shoe he wanted when a voice cut through the air. Well now, what have we got here? Silas turned. The man wore a tarnished silver star pinned to a sweat-stained vest, a belly thick with beer and self-importance, strained the buttons of his shirt and sagged over his gun belt. His eyes were small and lazy, but they held a shrewd, reptilian cunning. This was Sheriff Cobb. Just passing through. Sheriff, Silas said, his tone even. Cobb's eyes flicked from Silas to Alara, who was frozen by the smithy's entrance. He let his gaze crawl over her, a slow, insulting appraisal that made Silas's fists clench. Passing through from where? Cobb asked. East, Silas replied, offering nothing more. And headed where? West. Cobb chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. A man of many words. I like that. Keeps a man from telling lies. He took a step closer, his focus entirely on Alara. What about you, girl? Cat got your tongue? Alara pressed herself back against the rough wood of the smithy, saying nothing, her eyes wide with panic. She's shy, Silas said, stepping slightly to block Cobb's view of her. And tired from the trail? Is that so? Cobb's smile was all insinuation. She your wife? We're traveling together. I see. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. This is a God-fearing town. Friend, we have rules. We don't take kindly to vagrants and their companions. You get your business done, and you be on your way by sunup. You understand me? Perfectly, Silas said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. Cobb held his gaze for a long moment, then spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. See that you do. He turned and sauntered away, leaving a trail of menace in his wake. Silas watched him go, then turned to Alara. Go on, he said, his voice softer now. It will be all right. Just get what we need. She gave a small, jerky nod and scurried across the street, a frightened mouse in a town of cats. The mercantile was dim and smelled of pickles and bolt cloth. Alara kept her head bowed, avoiding the sharp, inquisitive gaze of the woman behind the counter. She gathered the few items Silas had asked for, her movements quick and furtive. When she paid, the woman snatched the coins from her hand as if she were afraid of catching a disease. Alara fled the store, her heart pounding. Silas was still at the smithy, deep in conversation about the horse. He had told her to wait, but the thought of standing on the street, exposed to the hostile stares, was unbearable. The saloon next door had its bat-wing doors propped open, and from within came the familiar sounds of piano music and male laughter. It was a public place. Perhaps she would be less conspicuous there, just for a moment. While she waited, taking a deep breath, she slipped inside, keeping to the shadows near the entrance. The saloon was hazy with smoke and smelled of stale beer and sweat. A few cowboys and ranchers lined the bar, and a game of cards was underway at a back table. She found a dark corner and tried to make herself invisible, her gaze fixed on the dirty floorboards. She just needed to wait until Silas was done. Then they could leave this terrible place. A burst of loud laughter from the bar made her flinch. She risked a glance up, her eyes scanning the faces of the men, and then her blood turned to ice water in her veins. It was him. Leaning against the bar, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, was a man with a cruel twist to his mouth and cold, dead eyes. Fletcher, the man who had kicked in her door. The man whose laughter had echoed in her home as her family was murdered. The world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the saloon faded into a distant, roaring hum. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, jagged thing. He had not seen her. He was turned slightly away, talking to the man beside him. Alara's first instinct was to run, to scream, to bolt from the room and never look back. But she was paralyzed, pinned in place by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight. This was the monster from her nightmares, made real and solid, standing not 10 feet away from her. As she stood there, frozen in the shadows, another man approached the bar, He was tall and impeccably dressed for a town like this. In a dark coat and a clean white shirt, he moved with an air of absolute authority, and the other men at the bar fell quiet and made way for him. His face was handsome in a severe sort of way, with a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent look of solemn piety. "Fletcher," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "A word." Fletcher immediately straightened up, his demeanor shifting from arrogant lounger to deferential subordinate. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," he said. Elias Thorne. The name, spoken aloud in this place, struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. She stared at the man, this pillar of the community, and a wave of sickening, horrifying certainty washed over her. She remembered Fletcher's words, spoken in the darkness of her burning home. Thorne was right. This was him. This pious, respected man was the one who had coveted their land. He was the one who had given the orders. Fletcher was just the rabid dog. Thorne was the master who held the leash. The man who had orchestrated the slaughter of her family was the benevolent ruler of Redemption Gulch. The hope for justice, a thing she had not even realized she was still carrying, died a final, brutal death. The wolves were not just in the town, they were running it. Thorne leaned in and spoke quietly to Fletcher, his back to Ilara. She could not hear the words, but she saw Fletcher nod. Thorne clapped his foreman on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership, and then turned to leave the saloon. As he turned, his gaze swept the room. It was a casual, dismissive glance, the look of a king surveying his domain, and then his eyes met Ilara's. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. Then she saw it, a flicker of confusion in the depths of his eyes, followed by a dawning, chilling recognition. It was a look of utter disbelief, as if he were seeing a ghost. His mask of civic leadership did not slip. His pleasant expression did not change, but the warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by something as cold and hard as a winter grave. He did not falter. He simply continued his smooth progress toward the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk. But Ilara knew. He had seen her. He had recognized her. Panic finally broke her paralysis. She turned and fled, bursting through the bat-wing doors and into the blinding sunlight. She ran to the smithy, her lungs burning. Silas was there, examining Abel's new shoe. "Silas!" she gasped, her voice raw with terror. "We have to go, now!" He looked up, startled by the sheer panic in her voice. "What is it? What happened?" "He's here," she cried, her words tumbling over one another. "The man from the saloon. His name is Fletcher. He was there, that night. He was one of them." Just as she spoke, Thorne and Fletcher exited the saloon. They stood on the boardwalk, talking quietly, but their attention was fixed on the smithy. Fletcher had seen her now, too. His face went pale, and then a look of pure, murderous rage crossed his features. He said something to Thorne, gesturing with his chin toward Ilara. Silas saw the look. He saw the way Fletcher's hand drifted down to rest on the butt of his pistol. He saw the cold, appraising way Thorne was watching them. He looked back at Ilara, at the absolute, undeniable terror in her eyes. And he believed her without a single shred of doubt. "The other one," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "The one he calls Thorne. He was the leader. He wanted our land. Silas. He's the one who did it." Silas's blood ran cold. He looked from the powerful rancher, the clear ruler of this town, to the terrified woman beside him. He understood their situation with perfect, horrifying clarity. "We can't run," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Not yet. Abel's not ready. We don't have enough supplies to last 2 days in the wilderness. We'd be chasing our own graves." "But they saw me," she pleaded, her eyes wild with fear. "They know who I am. We can't stay here." "We have to," he insisted, his grip tightening on her arm. "Just until morning. We are trapped. Ilara." She looked past him, at the two men standing on the boardwalk. Thorne's face was a mask of calm composure, but his eyes, even from this distance, promised death. Fletcher's face was an open book of hate. The look of recognition in their eyes was not just a threat. It was a death sentence. The fragile hope they had carried into Redemption Gulch had curdled into the certainty of a well-laid trap, and they had just walked right into its jaws. The gears of Elias Thorne's mind turned with cold, silent precision. The girl, Ilara, was not a person to him. She was a complication, a ghost who had wandered out of a sealed and buried tomb. Her existence was a direct threat to the carefully constructed edifice of his life in Redemption Gulch. His power was built not on overt force, but on the lie of his own righteousness. He was a pillar of the church, a civic leader, a man whose wealth was seen as a sign of God's favor. A public accusation from a half-wild immigrant girl, even if no one believed it, would be a crack in that foundation. Cracks spread. Questions festered. He needed to eliminate her, but it had to be done in a way that reinforced his position, not weakened it. A simple killing in an alley was messy, the work of common thugs. His solution had to be elegant, a piece of theater for the town that would cast him as the victim and them as the interlopers. He found Sheriff Cobb in the saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey. Thorne did not need to issue direct orders. A few quiet words, a suggestion heavy with the weight of Thorne's patronage, was all it took. He spoke of the town's safety, of the unsettling presence of the drifter and his strange, silent companion. He mentioned the recent theft of a valuable silver locket from the mercantile, a piece belonging to the widow Abernathy. A sentimental item, a crime that would offend the town's sense of decency. A man like that, Thorne murmured, placing a heavy gold coin on the bar for the sheriff's drink, is capable of anything. It would be a great relief to the good people of this town if you were to be thorough in your duties. Sheriff. Cobb's lazy eyes met Thorne's. He understood perfectly. He palmed the coin and nodded. I'll be as thorough as the situation requires. Mr. Thorne. The trap was set. Silas and Ilara took a room at the town's only boarding house, a grim, cheerless place run by a woman with eyes as hard as river stones. The room was small and airless, the walls thin enough to hear the whispers of the other boarders. The entire town felt like a cage, its bars made of hostile stares and muttered judgments. They spent the afternoon in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the blacksmith to finish, waiting for the sun to set, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Silas went to the livery to pay the smith and make sure Abel was settled for the night. Stay here, he told Ilara, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. She nodded, her face pale. The moment he was gone, the silence of the small room became a screaming thing. Every creak of the floorboards in the hall outside was the sound of approaching doom. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands clenched into fists, her entire body a knot of fear. The knock on the door was loud and authoritative. Open up! Sheriff's business! It was not Silas. Ilara shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. A key scraped in the lock, and the door swung open. Sheriff Cobb filled the doorway, two grim-faced townsmen behind him. He paid her no mind, his eyes sweeping the small room. He moved with a theatrical slowness, picking up Silas's saddlebags from the floor. He made a show of unbuckling the straps and rummaging inside. Well, well, he said, his voice booming for the benefit of the people gathering in the hallway. He pulled out a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Looks like our stranger is more than just a vagrant. He's a common thief. At that moment, Silas came walking down the hall. He saw Cobb, the locket, the crowd of accusatory faces. He saw the triumphant smirk on the sheriff's face and understood instantly. That's not mine, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. That's what they all say. Cobb sneered. You're under arrest for the theft of property from Mrs. Abernathy's mercantile. He drew his pistol. I wouldn't try anything foolish. We don't take kindly to thieves in Redemption Gulch. Silas knew it was useless to fight. Not here, not now. To resist would be to give them the excuse they needed to kill him on the spot. He slowly raised his hands, his eyes finding Alara's across the room. The look he gave her was not one of fear, but of grim warning. Be smart. Stay alive. They dragged him from the room and down the stairs, the crowd parting before them, their faces a uniform mask of righteous anger. The town had its verdict. The preacher's sermon had been a prophecy fulfilled. The outsider was a sinner, a thief, and the wild-eyed girl was his accomplice, a whore tainted by his wickedness. Their guilt was a foregone conclusion, as plain and simple as the dust on the street. Silas was thrown into the town's jail, a flimsy wooden structure with a single barred window and a heavy, bolted door. Alara was left utterly alone, an island in a sea of hostility. When she tried to leave the boarding house, the woman who owned it blocked her path. "Your man's credit is no good here," she snapped. "Pay for the room or get out." When Alara admitted she had no more money, the woman threw her few belongings into the street and slammed the door in her face. She was a pariah. No one would speak to her. No one would meet her eyes. She was a ghost in their midst, a symbol of the wickedness they believed had invaded their town. She wandered the street, directionless, the weight of 100 hateful stares pressing down on her, until she found herself in the shadows of an alleyway between the saloon and the mercantile. "You should have kept running, girl!" The voice came from the darkness behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Fletcher emerged from the shadows, his cruel mouth twisted into a triumphant sneer. He smelled of whiskey and malice. "Your man is done for," he said, taking a slow, menacing step toward her. "They're shipping him off to the circuit judge tomorrow. Funny thing about that road, though real easy for a prisoner to try and escape. Real easy for him to get shot for his trouble." Alara backed away until her shoulders hit the rough wood of the alley wall. "You lie," she whispered. "Do I?" He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now she could see the flecks of yellow in his cold eyes. "Thorne doesn't like loose ends, and you, girl, are the loosest end I've ever seen." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm giving you some friendly advice. You disappear. You get out of this town tonight and you never, ever come back. You forget you ever saw me. You forget the name Thorne. You do that, and maybe you get to live a while longer." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "But if you don't, if I see your face in this town come morning, well, let's just say I'll show you what happened to your ma and PA was a kindness. I'll make it last a long, long time." He smiled then, a terrible, predatory expression. He expected her to cry. He expected her to collapse in terror. He had seen her as a frightened, paralyzed girl, and he believed that was all she was. But something inside Alara snapped. The terror that had been her constant companion for months, the fear that had kept her mute and huddled and afraid, was suddenly consumed by a white-hot surge of pure, cold fury. It was a rage born of 1,000 injustices, of a family slaughtered, of a life stolen, of a town's cruel judgment. And overriding it all was a fierce, protective fire for the one person who had shown her kindness, the man who was now in a cage because of her. She would not let him be sacrificed. The instinct that had kept her alive in the cellar, the passive will to survive, was transformed in that instant into an active, ferocious will to fight. She looked up at Fletcher, and for the first time, she did not look away. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a loathing so pure and so intense that it made him take an involuntary step back. "I am not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, steady thing. She pushed past him and walked out of the alley, leaving him standing in the shadows, his smug confidence momentarily shaken. She did not run. She walked with a purpose she had not felt since before the fire. She knew what she had to do. She marched directly to the sheriff's office. A crowd was still gathered outside, basking in the excitement of the day's events. She pushed through them, ignoring their jeers and insults. She threw open the door and stood before Sheriff Cobb, who was sitting with his boots up on his desk. "Silas is innocent," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You know he is." Cobb slowly lowered his feet to the floor. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Go on home, girl. Your boyfriend's not seeing any visitors." "He is not a thief," she said, her voice rising. "He was framed by you, by Elias Thorne." The sheriff's face hardened. A murmur went through the crowd at the door. Elara took a deep breath and spoke the words she had kept locked away for so long, the truth that had been festering inside her like a poison. "Elias Thorne and his foreman, Fletcher, murdered my family, my father, my mother, and my younger brother. They burned our home to the ground to hide what they did. Also, Thorne could steal our land and our water. And you," she said, her fingers shaking as she pointed at Cobb, "you are helping him cover it up." A shocked silence fell over the room, followed by an explosion of mocking laughter. "She's crazy!" someone from the crowd yelled. "The drifter's whore has lost her mind!" another shouted. Cobb stood up, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough out of you," he snarled. "That is a vile and slanderous accusation against the finest man in this county. You're hysterical. Now get out of my office before I throw you in a cell right next to your murdering thief of a lover." Her words had failed, just as they had in Jasper Creek. The town's walls of prejudice and fear were too thick to be penetrated by the truth. But as they pushed her out of the office and into the street, Elara felt not defeat, but a strange sense of liberation. She had spoken. She had faced the monsters and called them by their names, and now she would save Silas. The main emotional climax unfolded with the inevitability of a thunderstorm. The next morning, Thorne decided not to wait. He spread the word that, for the prisoner's own safety from the town's righteous anger, he was being transported immediately to the county seat to await the circuit judge. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. This was an execution, plain and simple. Fletcher and a lanky deputy brought a wagon to the front of the jail. A small crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. Elara stood among them, her face pale but her eyes burning with a fierce, calculated resolve. She watched as they unbolted the jailhouse door and brought Silas out, his hands bound in front of him. This was the moment. As Fletcher and the deputy shoved Silas toward the wagon, Elara acted. She ran to the watering trough in front of the livery, grabbed the heavy wooden bucket, and with a strength she did not know she possessed, she heaved it at the team of horses hitched to a nearby freight wagon. The bucket crashed against the horses' flanks, and the animals, already skittish, screamed and reared in their harnesses, their eyes rolling in panic. They lunged forward, snapping a rein, and the heavy wagon careened sideways into the street, directly into the path of the prisoner transport. Chaos erupted. Men shouted and scrambled to get out of the way of the panicking horses. For 5 critical seconds, every eye was on the runaway wagon. Every eye but Silas's. He saw the diversion for what it was. He saw Elara. In that split second of chaos, he moved. He brought his bound hands up and smashed them down on the deputy's head, who crumpled to the ground. Fletcher, startled, turned and reached for his pistol, but Silas was faster. He drove his shoulder hard into Fletcher's chest, sending the bigger man staggering backward. The town square devolved into a desperate, gritty brawl. Silas was not a gunslinger, but he was a man fighting for his life, and for the life of the woman he loved. He kicked Fletcher's fallen pistol away and met the foreman's enraged charge with a fury of his own. It was not a clean fight. They crashed into a hitching rail, trading desperate, clumsy blows. Silas took a punch to the jaw that made his vision swim, but he answered with a brutal headbutt that sent Fletcher reeling back, blood pouring from his nose. Sheriff Cobb, bellowing with rage, drew his own weapon, but before he could aim, Elara, who had snatched a heavy piece of firewood from a nearby stack, swung it with all her might against the back of his knees. The sheriff's legs buckled, and he went down with a surprised grunt. Silas saw his chance. He scooped up the sheriff's fallen pistol and got the upper hand on the dazed Fletcher, pressing the barrel of the gun under his chin. The fighting stopped. The crowd fell silent, their bloodlust turning to stunned apprehension. In the sudden quiet, Silas's voice rang out, raw and commanding. He ignored the men he had fought, his eyes finding Elias Thorne, who stood on the boardwalk of the Mercantile, his face a perfect mask of shock and dismay. "This is not my crime," Silas shouted, his voice echoing in the street. "This is his, Elias Thorne. He murdered Alara's family for their land. He sent Fletcher here to do his killing. And he framed me to silence her. He is the murderer. He is the thief." Most faces in the crowd remained hard, unwilling to believe this sudden, violent accusation against their benefactor. But here and there, a seed of doubt was planted. A few men shifted their feet. A few glanced at Thorne with a flicker of uncertainty. They had seen the drifter fight, not like a common thief, but like a cornered animal protecting its own. They knew they could not win. They had not proven a thing. They had only bought themselves a few precious seconds. Justice was impossible here. Their only option was to flee. "Elara, now!" Silas yelled. She was already moving, untying Abel from the rail in front of the smithy. She scrambled onto the horse's bare back. Silas shoved Fletcher into the dust and backed away, keeping the gun leveled on the crowd. He reached the horse in 3 long strides and swung himself up behind Elara, his arms encircling her waist. He dug his heels into Abel's flanks, and the horse leaped forward, galloping down the dusty street and out of town. A few scattered gunshots followed them, but they were already a cloud of dust on the horizon. They rode out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, with the sound of a posse forming behind them. Their flight was not a retreat. It was not an admission of guilt. It was a profound declaration, a desperate and defiant claim on their own lives, a commitment to each other against the entire hostile world. They rode until the world was a blur of dust and pain. Redemption Gulch vanished behind them, swallowed by the horizon, but its presence lingered, a phantom at their backs. They pushed Abel without mercy, the horse's powerful lungs heaving, his coat lathered in sweat. Silas rode with the sheriff's pistol tucked in his belt, his arms a steel band around Elara, holding her steady against the jarring rhythm of their flight. They did not speak. There were no words for this, only the pounding of hooves, the rasp of their own breathing, and the constant, terrified listening for the sounds of pursuit. The land they fled into was a brutal accomplice to the men who hunted them. It was a broken country of sharp-edged canyons and water-starved creek beds, a place that offered 1,000 places to hide and 1,000 ways to die. For 3 days, they lived on adrenaline and the last of their stolen supplies. They rode until darkness forced them to stop, and then only for a few hours of fitful, exhausted sleep, one of them always awake, listening. Silas's face grew gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by a lack of sleep and a surplus of vigilance. Elara, pressed against his back, could feel the tension humming through him, a constant, low-grade tremor of a man stretched to his breaking point. She was no longer the fragile, broken thing he had found by the river. The fire that had been lit in the alleyway with Fletcher had not been extinguished. It had banked into a hot, steady coal of resolve. She was a partner in this flight, her eyes scanning the back trail, her hands ready to help with the horse, with their meager camp, with whatever was needed. On the 4th day, Abel began to falter. The horse, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, was stumbling, his head low. Silas knew they could not go on like this. To kill the horse was to kill themselves. It was mid-afternoon, the sun a merciless eye in the sky. When he saw it, a thin, almost invisible crack in a high wall of red rock, choked with overgrown juniper and mesquite. It did not look like much, but it was a deviation in the solid face of the canyon, and it was enough. He dismounted and led the exhausted horse into the opening. The crack widened into a narrow, winding passage that snaked its way into the heart of the rock. After 100 yards, it opened into a hidden box canyon, a secret world no bigger than a church meeting hall. A thin trickle of water, green with moss, seeped from a crack in the far wall, pooling in a shallow basin of stone before disappearing into the sandy ground. A few cottonwood trees, their leaves a vibrant, impossible green against the red rock, offered shade. The canyon walls rose a sheer 200 feet on all sides, a natural fortress. The only way in was the way they had come. It was a sanctuary. For a long moment, they both just stood there, letting the sudden, profound silence of the place wash over them. The sounds of their own frantic escape, the wind, the hoofbeats, the pounding of their hearts, faded away, leaving a quiet so deep it felt holy. Silas slowly, reverently, led Abel to the pool of water. The horse drank, long and deep, his body shuddering with relief. The emotional dam that had been held in place by sheer, desperate momentum finally broke. The aftermath of their ordeal washed over them in a sickening wave. Now that they were still, the pain made itself known. Elara slid from Abel's back, her legs buckling beneath her. Silas caught her, his own body screaming with exhaustion. They were battered, bruised, and coated in a thick layer of grime, but they were alive, and they were together. He helped her to the shade of a cottonwood, and she sank to the ground, her back against its trunk. He tended to the horse first, his movements slow and deliberate, removing the saddle and bridle, checking for injuries, rubbing the animal down with handfuls of dry grass. When he was sure Abel was cared for, he turned his attention to Elara. She sat with her eyes closed, her face a pale mask of weariness. A long, angry scratch ran along her forearm, a gift from the splintered firewood she had wielded against the sheriff. It was beaded with dried blood and dirt. Silas knelt before her, his water bag in his hand. He poured a little of the precious liquid onto his neckerchief and, without a word, gently began to clean the wound. His touch was shockingly tender. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard work, moved with a delicate reverence, as if he were tending to the most fragile thing in the world. He cleaned the dirt from the cut, his fingers brushing against her skin, and a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived. The immediate danger had passed, and in its place, the unsaid emotions that had simmered beneath the surface of their shared trauma rose, thick and palpable in the quiet air. This was more than just a man cleaning a wound. This was an act of profound care, a gesture of unspoken love that was clearer than any declaration. Elara opened her eyes and looked at him. His face was inches from hers, his expression one of deep, unguarded concentration. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw, the way a stray lock of his sun-bleached hair fell across his forehead. She saw the man who had offered food to a ghost, the man who had killed snakes for her, the man who had listened to her story and believed, and, "Thank you," she whispered, her voice husky. He paused, his hand hovering over her arm. He looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. "For what?" "For believing me," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "In the town, no one else. They all looked at me like I was crazy, but you didn't, and you fought for me." He finished cleaning the cut and slowly tied the damp cloth around her arm as a makeshift bandage. He did not let go of her hand when he was done. He held it, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "I wasn't just fighting for you, Elara," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked down at their joined hands, as if the words he needed to say were written there. "When I was in that cell, waiting for them to come get me, I wasn't thinking about dying. Not really. I was thinking that I'd never see you again." He finally raised his eyes to hers, and in their depths she saw a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. A life without you in it. It is not a life I can imagine anymore. So I guess I was fighting for myself, too. His confession, simple and unadorned, was the most profound thing she had ever heard. It was a truth stripped bare of all pretense, a declaration of need that was as essential as water in the desert. The romantic love and intense desire that had been a powerful undercurrent to their shared ordeal finally broke the surface. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, the space between them charged with a winter's worth of unspoken longing and the fierce, electric relief of being alive. He raised his free hand, the one not holding hers, and gently, hesitantly, traced the line of her jaw. His touch was a question and a statement all at once. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment, a silent, complete surrender to the truth that now stood between them. He whispered her name, and it was not a word, but a prayer. "Elara." And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tender kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation and defiance, a raw, hungry claiming of life in a world that had offered them nothing but pain. It was the frantic, grateful kiss of two people who had almost lost everything and had found in each other the only thing that mattered. It tasted of dust and sweat and sorrow. But underneath it all was the fierce, undeniable sweetness of survival. His arms went around her, pulling her close, and hers went around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. This was not a soft romance. It was the ultimate act of defiance, a fierce claiming of happiness in the very teeth of despair. Their love was their final, unbreakable sanctuary. They stayed in the canyon for 2 days, letting their bodies and their horse recover. In their isolation, a new kind of intimacy bloomed, quiet and deep. They spoke of the future, not with hope for a peaceful life, but with the grim acceptance of their reality. "Thorn won't stop," Silas said as they sat by a small, smokeless fire on the second night. "His pride is worth more to him than his land. The lie about us, about me being a thief and you being whatever they want to call you, that lie will travel by telegraph. It will get to every town west of here before we do. So we can never stop running," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "No," he said quietly. "I do not think we can." The tragedy of her past was not erased. His guilt over his sister did not simply vanish. Those sorrows were a permanent part of who they were. Scars on their souls that would never fully fade. But they were no longer wounds they had to bear alone. They had each other. On the morning of the third day, they knew it was time to leave. Silas saddled Abel, his movements now a familiar comfort to Elara. She stood at the mouth of the narrow passage, looking out at the vast, wild expanse of the west. It was a land of brutal beauty, of harsh realities and breathtaking possibilities. It promised nothing. It offered no guarantees of safety or peace. It was a wilderness, and they were now a part of it. Silas came to stand beside her. He did not speak, but reached down and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was strong and warm, a solid anchor in an uncertain world. She was no longer the girl he had found by the river. That girl had sat with her head down, her gaze fixed on the dirt, her world a prison of her own making. This woman stood tall, her shoulders back. She was not looking at the ground. She was looking at the horizon, her eyes clear and steady, facing the unknown future without flinching. They had lost everything, their families, their homes, their names, their place in the world. But in the heart of that immense loss, they had found each other. They had found a reason to survive, a glimmer of hope as resilient and stubborn as the wild, unforgiving landscape that stretched out before them. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.